interview, we are joined with a couple of our senior designers. To start off, why don't you guys, say your name, say your position, and then just talk a little bit about your experience as a game designer, just in the field, and add in like one of your favorite like projects that you worked on in the past. Derek, why don't we start with you?
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Derek Chin. I'm the design director here at Temple. My position involves basically managing the design team and coordinating with production, engineering, art, and making sure that priorities for what we're working on are set. And my guys, such as Toby, are working on the right stuff, as well as jumping in where I'm needed as well. I've been in the industry for about 12 to 15 years, depending on where you want to start counting. One of my first jobs was working on a tactical collectible game called Poxnora. Don't know how many of you are old enough to have played that game, but it is a complicated thing, and that's probably my favorite project in the sense that it was at a time where I got to go in there and basically just create entire swaths of content, like expansions, creating all the characters, spells, etc., that they would be using, and just basically building the world as I make the content. And I had a lot of leeway in that position in order to do that.
Yeah, I don't think I've heard of Toxinora, but that does sound like a really fun time. Like just really having so much open design space to work your magic.
Yeah, by the time I joined, it was a fairly well-established project, and so there was like developed tools. The way we built abilities for the characters was actually in a proprietary scripting system that was like XML based. So I could make almost anything in that system.
Nice. How about you, Toby?
So I'm a senior game designer on the Bazaar. I do a lot of the same stuff that Derek does, but like less of the planning and meeting stuff, and I'm more in the weeds with like card and character design and encounter design, monster design, which obviously Derek is also involved in, but all that kind of stuff. But I do all kinds of different things, from writing specs to coming up with ideas for new cards to balancing cards to implementing cards to helping engineers work on the engine to whatever it takes basically. I've been in the industry also about 12 to 15 years depending on when you start counting. I started at Stardock, which is a 4X strategy game company, essentially a PC. They're like a large indie, I would call them, working on games such as Sins of a Solar Empire Rebellion, which is probably my favorite game I ever worked on, Sorcerer King, Elemental Fallen Enchantress, a bunch of 4X strategy fantasy games. After that, I worked at Dots, Play Dots, on games such as Two Dots, which is a very popular mobile puzzle game if you haven't played it. And then I worked on new games there, which included a bunch of merge and match 3 stuff. Always trying to find ways to make them more complicated and more speak to my people, because I like complex stuff.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, that's awesome.
If something is broken or overpowered, you blame Toby.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, yeah. Now you guys know. Now you guys know who to go to. So you guys can see we've got a lot of experience on the design team. Super excited about it. Why don't you guys talk a little bit about like how you got into design? Did you have any like particular games when you were either growing up or that like inspired you? Toby, why don't you go first this time?
I mean, I've played games my whole life, and I've been inspired to make games my whole life. I made old RPGs on my TI-85 calculator just for fun. I made like tabletop RPGs when I was like 8 with dice, like weird little games. I make board games in my spare time, but just kind of all games have inspired me. Loved the old like Warcraft 2 editors way back in the day, and I remember making Wolfenstein 3D levels when I was like 10. So it's kind of been everywhere and all the time. I never really knew specific, like when I was young, I didn't know game designers existed, like as a concept, because it was very early. I'm over 40. It was very early in the days of game creation. And so I got into programming initially because I thought that was the way to get into gaming. And then at Stardock, I was initially a web developer. Just got a job in the door, but I loved working on games. I loved game stuff, and I showed my aptitude for game design and testing and all kinds of stuff, and kind of worked my way into position in game design there. So it's kind of was like a unique journey for me. But I've always loved systems and games and cards and everything and the way things fit together. So it's always kind of spoken to me.
Derek, how about you?
For any aspiring game designers out there, I would say the best advice is just to start making stuff, and just do it. If you're interested in making games, start making games. And what Toby describes is unique to him, but also not uncommon in the industry, in the sense that, especially us older generation game designers, we tended to come from a place of just various ways. Nowadays, you have a lot of programs that teach game design, but for the most part, when I'm interviewing for game designers, what I'm looking for is that they have made stuff, that they have put in the initiative, and they just didn't go to school, and so personally, yeah, similar story to Toby. Always been making stuff. When I was quite young, I would draw like spaceships and then like give them stats. And so it wasn't so much a game, but in looking back now, I was basically creating content for an imaginary game that was in my head, right? I'm like, it has these weapons and it rolls, 2d4, and like I was basically building like an RPG system without knowing that I was doing that, because back then, this was in Hong Kong as well, so Dungeons and Dragons wasn't even on the radar
Yeah.
in any way. So later on, I would do stuff with my brother where he loved like toy cars, and so I would basically like piece together large pieces of paper and like level design out entire cities, and with like stuff for him to drive his cars around and play. We weren't that well off, so I was making stuff for him that maybe other families would have bought.
No, yeah, that's awesome. I remember growing up doing like similar stuff where you would like lay out the huge sheets of construction paper and like draw out the roads and like racetracks. So that's awesome. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Oh,
Um,
and another
yeah, go ahead.
thing. So, my degree is in economics. And I think that's actually quite helpful. That said, it actually doesn't matter very much. I've had game designers who have art history degrees, who, or are English majors, and as long as you can use the tools, spreadsheets, flowcharts, Word documents, and have a mind and a desire to actually, work in games and make games and just practice doing it. Yeah, you can leverage most degrees and the knowledge that you have accumulated in other areas of your life. Yeah, and that actually just reminded me. I have also designed golf courses in the past, even though I've never played golf. But it's game design. You're building a level.
Yeah, I technically have a computer science degree, but as much as possible, I avoid trying to actively use it. I don't really love programming. I'm a programmer to get things done, not to do it the right way, which is not the way you want to do it in large enterprise software. But it has been very helpful to like understand how pieces fit together, how a database works, be able to write queries. Like there's a lot of stuff that is tertiary to actually writing code that it's really important to understand how everything fits together and how all the pieces work. That is really helpful as a game designer, even if you're not actually sitting there writing lots of code.
Yeah, having some kind of technical knowledge and background is very, very helpful. One of the primary jobs of a game designer is to talk to the other disciplines, and having some base level of knowledge allows you to do that much more effectively.
And statistics. Statistics are critical. Like, you don't need to be a stats wizard, but knowing like the core basics of probability and other more advanced statistical stuff is really important.
Yeah, that
Yep.
makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. So, do you guys have any like games right now that you guys are playing that you like really enjoy? And when you do like play new games or find new games, do you think like your position as a game designer gives you a different like view on them, maybe than other people would have?
I'm always playing games like constantly. I feel like you kind of need to both stay up with what's trending and what's most what's working and what isn't, and then just to keep your brain active for this stuff. Games that I've been playing like most recently that I've been really into is I played a whole bunch of Harvestella, which is like a Square Enix hybrid between Stardew Valley and Final Fantasy kind of thing. I always am playing board games. I play Tabletop Simulator. Tomorrow I'm playing a 12-hour game of Twilight Imperium in person. Uh, I'm playing a lot of War Tales, which is awesome. It's like a mercenary band simulator. I tried out Wild Frost. I played a lot of Dredge recently, Potionomics, a bunch of like strategy, RPG, board game, cardy, auto battler stuff is the kind of the stuff that I play for fun, and then it translates very directly into the kind of stuff that we're making.
Yeah, right now I'm playing Mechabellum, um, the new hotness, I suppose. Uh, in general, I enjoy a lot of roguelikes and auto battlers. One of my favorite games of all time is probably Into the Breach. Um, I think that game is stellar in its execution, even if it's not, as replayable as some other games.
Yeah, it's so funny. I didn't really like it because of that specifically.
Yeah.
Because it felt too dialed in, like too. It felt more like a puzzle game than a tactical game, and I wanted a tactical game, not a puzzle game.
Yeah, it presents itself very much like a tactical game, right? But yeah, it's much more puzzle, but like what's there is like polished in a way that's very rare.
Oh yeah, it was a very good game, and it was very well made. It was just kind of not the thing I wanted
Yeah.
from it.
And that's reasonable.
Yeah, makes sense.
But yeah, my guilty pleasure game right now is Star Rail.
Oh, Star
Oh
Realms is
yeah,
great.
nice.
I just got the Star Wars deck building game, physical game that I'm looking forward to play. That it looks like a blatant ripoff of Star Realms, but have not
No,
had.
okay. Star
Wait,
Realms is good.
You say Star Realm?
I'm
Sorry,
talking about Star
Star
Rail.
Realms, Star Rail. Okay.
Yeah, it's the
Yeah.
new
Oh yes,
Genshin
You were telling me about
Hoyoverse thing.
yeah.
Yeah,
Oh yeah. I played it
it's
for
a
like a
game.
day and a half.
There you go. Even developers play gotcha games.
Oh, you got it. I love gotcha games, honestly.
There you go.
It's
I
just
came
so
from
pretty.
mobile.
Like they have
Exactly
so much
true.
money, they can make such pretty things.
True. The art is just phenomenal.
Honest, if we're being honest, I would play Star Rail if I could skip the dialogue. I hate the story stuff and I hate the dialogue, and you can't skip it, and it takes forever. And it's the same thing that eventually washed me out of the Genshin, their other game.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't tend to play a lot of JRPGs in general because I mean, as a father and somebody who, is in my position, like I just don't have the time to sink like 60 or 70 hours into every JRPG as much as sometimes I'd like to.
Yeah, 100%. What would you guys say is your favorite part? Like, if you had to break it down, what's your favorite part of being a game designer? Like, the part you really enjoy?
That I get to make stuff up and then see it happen. Like,
Yeah, that's true. I've been absolutely geeking out about a bunch of cards that I designed a couple weeks ago that are getting art made for them right now, and seeing the art roll in and seeing them become like real things has been like unbelievably cool.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like watching your creations like actually come to life.
Yep. I would say that for me, a lot of it is the variety. Like, I love that also, seeing like things you're making, like coming up with ideas. Like I'm sitting on my couch coming up with ideas for these new cards, and then 2 weeks later, they're like real cards that I'm seeing the art for. But I also just like that that's not all you do. Like, I think every day you're kind of doing something different and something new. And I think having that variety keeps it from ever getting boring, right?
yep.
Definitely, yeah. So, what does like a day in your position look like working at Tempo? Derek, why don't you start us off?
So it always starts off with meetings. I meet with the other directors to update them on what my team is doing, and I get updates from them on what their teams are doing, so that we're aligned on what's happening in the studio at a high level. After that, we go into our regular daily stand-ups with the members of our team, so that we know what they're working on, and I can give them any updates that are needed from the other departments. And then most of my day tends to be spent in meetings, either with team members on particular tasks. For example, yesterday we did a kickoff on a feature that we're putting into the game, so that we could align as the design team and the engineering team, figure out how do we pull this off, this idea that we have. And then the other part is I spend a lot of time with production in order to figure out like what's the priority, and then how to track and make sure that the work is being done in a way that is good and getting to completion. Because one of the hardest things to do, and you experience this yourself, if you guys are making your own games or whatever, or any other project, really, it's getting to the finish line is the difficult part. Like having the ideas and thinking about them and getting excited about it. Like that first 20 to 40% is like super fast. Then the next set is pretty okay, but like getting that last 20% in and having it be done, that's the part that often needs somebody who's just dragging that boulder across the finish line and making sure it gets there. So that's my job.
Makes sense. Making sure that the designers aren't like trying to be too much of perfectionists and tweaking everything exactly how they want it, actually like finishing at some point.
Yeah, and with games in particular, like a card isn't just the game design, right? There's art involved, there's engineering involved, there's QA side of things, and how it fits into the entire framework of the game, and all the other items that are involved. So like it's not one person, and often the part of the job is making sure that all those pieces get aligned.
Yeah, perfect. How about you, Toby? Does your day differ in any meaningful ways, or pretty much the same?
Mine's pretty different. I start with stand up. Usually, I don't have a bunch of director meetings ahead of time. It's the benefit of being senior and not director. But after that, I have either a bunch of coordination meetings, although mine are much more on the approving UI changes, or talking to Andre about design ideas, like things we're thinking about for new cards or new meta features or things like that, and much less about like informing other people above us. And then when I have time, I'm often either in specs in Confluence, like writing a bunch of specs about how a system should work or how an advanced feature should function, or disseminating information like that to engineers or UI designers to get mockups or to get systems started on them, or in spreadsheets changing cards and coming up with new ideas for stuff. So it can kind of be whatever thing is on the docket that week, but it's usually a mixture of meetings and that stuff. And then usually during the day, it's mostly meetings. Like most of my day is meetings. And then after the day ends, I'll go sit on the couch with my laptop and write specs, or fiddle with spreadsheets and stuff.
Yeah, I do think that that's some part of the job that a lot of people probably like don't consider when they're thinking about it, if they aren't in industry or they don't know much about it, is like the amount, like there are a lot of different departments. It's not like the design team sits down and just like poof, they make everything. There's not, you have to meet with like development team who are doing like the actual engineering, and the art team who's like we talked about, making the cards come to life. So like making sure that all of those teams and stuff are all on the same page is just as a big of a part of the job as like the actual design and creation portion.
Yeah, I usually say that like at least 50% of your job is communication as a game designer. It's really important to have a mind for game design and like understand what's going to be fun and how things are going to fit together and what's going to get people excited. But so much of what you do is about communicating your ideas to other people, both the players so they understand what you're trying to accomplish, and then also the teams, so that the UI people know what they need to be showing to players based on what your idea is, and making sure the engineers are making everything work the way that you intend it to work. That you need to be hand in hand with people and able to communicate in a variety of ways, right? communicate through your specs, communicate through meetings, and talking to people directly, and then being available for people. And it's just really important to be able to communicate.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's also true even like internal to the design team, right?
Yep.
Like I think one of the worst positions a game designer can be in is like being the only game designer on a feature or on a project, because then you don't have that other perspective, other communications, and you're not being challenged on your ideas. You know, one of the things I look for on a design team is to have a variety of experiences on the team, and they come from different backgrounds or have different experiences, because then it makes it much easier for them to just not nod their heads and everyone agree because they all like the same games. It's like we need to consider other perspectives and be able to defend our positions, because that, even if you are right, doing that, going through that process makes the decision you're making much stronger and forces you to think about things that maybe you may have missed.
Yeah, really looking at it from all sides the same way the audience will eventually come from all different sides of backgrounds, and they'll be looking at it in all ways. That makes a lot of sense. What is your favorite part about working on the bazaar specifically? And is there anything about the bazaar that makes you like really excited or is unique to the game versus the past things you've worked on? Toby, why don't you start us off?
I mean, I love designing cards and characters and skills and all the different pieces that fit together. I also like how open people have been to adjusting things, particularly Andre. I've worked in environments where people can be very tied to their initial ideas, and I think that can be a very problematic situation to be in. And I mean, I joined the project fairly late. I started like late last year, and had a lot of ideas for things we could tweak and adjust to make the game better, and being met with a lot of positivity and like encouragement onto like, hey, some of these things make a lot of sense, was really nice. And then just making content for this game is very fun. So yeah.
Perfect. Derek?
Yeah, a lot of similar things. I really like the game, actually, just the core game of what it is. So it's exciting to work on a project that you really believe in terms of like how the game works. And yeah, the structure of the game and the way it plays makes it really easy to create lots of fun and interesting content. And that's very exciting.
Perfect. Cool. Um, So, kind of moving on towards some kind of like philosophy questions, I'd love to hear from you guys about like if there's any core tenets or like specific things that you think really influence your overall design philosophy when it comes to specifically creating the content. Like, what do you think like is the part that you really like to bring, especially in these types of conversations? Like Derek was just talking about, where everyone is kind of presenting their ideas and trying to look at things from every side of the project. What are kind of the core things that you think influence you? Derek, why don't you start us off on this one?
So the first thing that comes to mind doesn't really apply to the second part of the question. But I think one of the things that I think about when it comes to game design is that mechanics and tools are not good or bad. They're just tools. And part of the job is actually to figure out which of those tools makes sense in a particular scenario and which don't. And there are some tools that sort of work against each other. If you put two mechanics in the same game, one will push you in one direction, that'll push you in the other. So for me, it's really important that you identify what the pillars of your game are and what the audience of your game is supposed to be. So then the decisions you're making around what mechanics or tools or features you put in the game align with those goals.
Yeah, perfect. That makes sense. Toby?
I would say that if we're talking from a like general design rule paradigm that I follow is very much like fun is paramount. Like I think that a lot of times designers can get super caught in the weeds of like balance, or like everything being fair or everything being a certain way. I think that it's really important to continuously focus on what is fun for a player, having meaningful choices, having interesting decision points, and making sure that you're not neutering your game so that it's fair and balanced but not fun anymore is really important. I think that polarization can actually be really powerful for a game. And I think honestly, a lot of my design principles often come from stuff from a lot of like Magic card design stuff. I'm a huge Magic player and fan, and I think they do a lot of really, really smart, good things in game design. But that's obviously not my only influence, but that's something that I often lean towards when thinking about core design philosophies.
Yeah, I
Perfect.
love the phrase meaningful choices, and is one I use pretty often. And maybe someday I'll get it like framed on my wall or something, because that is basically what makes games fun, right? The choices you make should have some meaning, either in terms of the gameplay, because it influences your gameplay and how the game plays out, or it because it's meaningful from like a personal, like emotional perspective. You know, there are
Yep.
games that are more experiences, but they're meaningful in a different way. So yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot to dig into with what makes a good, meaningful choice, also, of like, if you're presenting choices that are overwhelming and it's hard for a player to know why one choice is better in one situation and another is another, that's a problem. Like, there's so many ways you can get at having a good choice and a bad choice for a player, both from the impact and from the comprehension and from like uh linearity, like how linear is the choice. Like, if I make this choice, does that lock me into one specific thing and make it so that I'm forced into a certain way of play? And you kind of have to balance all that stuff, right, to try and make the best choices you can.
Yeah, you also mentioned balance, and that is something that I admit that, you know, as a younger designer, a junior designer, that was very much like on the forefront of my brain, right? Like,
Yeah.
balance is paramount. And as I matured, I realized that that's not the case. You know,
Yeah.
balance is a tool we use to generate meaningful choices, to generate fun, to basically offer you choices. And having everything be balanced as a goal is functionally almost impossible to achieve, and also doesn't get you the result you actually
Yeah.
want.
Yeah, it's something that you see a lot in Magic card, both design and analysis, where people will talk about like a draft format and say, "Hey, is it perfectly balanced across all 5 colors?" And it's like, sure, it can be, but it can still be a terrible draft environment, or it can be really imbalanced, but it's still a great draft environment. And the thing that actually impacts it is, how does the balance affect the gameplay, right? Of like, if it's completely imbalanced and one color is not playable, that's maybe okay if another color is playable enough that you can go deeper into it, right? And that the gameplay itself is fun enough that you can adjust around that, right? So I think, like, one of my old design mentors always stressed this with me, of like, just because something is fair doesn't mean it's fun, and just because something is not fair doesn't mean it's not fun. And there's a line there to toe, right? Like, if a game is not balanced properly to an extreme measure, then it becomes not fun because you have no meaningful choices and because you're just always picking the thing that is overpowered. So there is a line there that you can't cross that will be a problem. But like, minor balance shifts are not actually that big of a deal, as long as there are, interesting ways to interact with the game and decisions to be made around that.
Yeah, that's perfect. It actually loops perfectly into our next question, which was about your philosophies on balance and things. And I really liked when you guys were talking how, talking about the philosophy of balance, and it really kind of ultimately led back into the core tenets you guys were talking about, which was that meaningful choices. Even if something isn't balanced, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not fun, as long as the player still gets to make those meaningful choices. And that's kind of the core of your guys' philosophy, it seems, and also like of what really feels like it makes the game fun, is you're getting to make those decisions, and you're not just like railroaded into, oh, this thing's so unbalanced that there's no choice, or everything is so balanced that it literally doesn't matter at all.
Yeah, there's an interesting question in the chat about, does balance, that makes sense for single player, but does it make sense for competitive and ladder? And to me, it's all of these questions have incredible amounts of minutia, right? They're not black and white. It depends on the game, is basically my answer. If you look at something like StarCraft, right, which is like a very pure competitive game where players have access to the same exact tools, there's no randomized elements, there's no elements that change in a run, then having slight imbalance can completely topple a competitive game like that. However, in a game like Magic, where there's drafting, or Bazaar, which ultimately is a drafting game, right? Like you don't have access to every single card at every single moment. Having cards that are not as balanced is mitigated partially by the rarity of those cards, how frequently they show up. And it can actually be a really positive thing, that it can be something that tells a player who may be less experienced, hey, this is a good card because it's rarer, right? Like having rare and mythic cards in Magic drafts is really important for making the environment comprehensible for players, right? And making it exciting when you open that cool card that's really powerful that you know is better than other cards, right? And there's limits to that. Like there are some cards that don't play well because they have no interaction points in Magic, for example, or there are some cards that, let's say in the Bazaar, that can limit player agency that they're playing against, or completely invalidate other builds. Those are not great places to be imbalanced, right? But it's okay to have some cards that are better than others, and some situations that are better than others, and even some strategies that are better than others, so long as you can't always like predictably enact that strategy on other players, right? In a game like StarCraft, you can just build what you want to build, and there is nothing stopping you from whatever you choose, right? To some extent, someone made an example of League of Legends. League of Legends balances somewhat around having drafts, right, in their character select, where if one character is super imbalanced, they're going to get banned. And certain characters are counters to other characters. So the character that you pick may be broken in certain situations, but they pick a different one that counters that character. So there's always these pushes and pulls. And in certain situations, certain games, yes, balance is paramount. But in games with randomized elements, or cards or drafting or that kind of thing, it becomes much less important. Not to say it's not important, still important, but it doesn't become the paramount thing that all fun balances on or hinges on.
Yep, you covered it quite well. I don't have anything to add.
Beautiful. I know we said we were going to go for 30 minutes. I only have 2 more questions. Do you guys have a couple more minutes to stick around?
Yeah. I don't think I have another meeting for half an hour, so I'm good until you need me.
Beautiful. I think this whole discussion ties really well into my next question, which is a question we actually get a lot during Q&As. What are your guys' kind of takes on meta, and like the term meta as it applies to the Bazaar? When you're designing things, do you think about like, designing a specific meta, or do you think like or does that not come into mind at all, or things along those lines?
Do you want to take that first, Derek, or do you want me to?
No, I think this is more your realm on this project. So
All
why don't you take it?
So I think, well, first off, I think there are 2 different ways of even talking about meta in games. We have 2 different thoughts of metas. Like there is the meta of what is the meta strategy for players, which I think is what you're referring to. But there's also the meta game of player progression outside of actual games. I'm assuming you want me to more talk about the first one and not the second one?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was referencing the first one, but I'd love to hear kind of just you talk about both. I think it's really interesting that, maybe that's something that most players wouldn't even think of, the second one. So
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I'll go to the one that you weren't talking about first, because I think it's faster to talk about. But the idea of having meta progression for players, like having a journey that a player takes through your game as they play it, which can be from a like card acquiring situation in something like Marvel Snap or Magic. It can be in like battle pass features that they have in like Magic Arena and those kind of things. Finding a way that every time the player plays the game, they can grow in some way. Some of that is going to be natural player growth, but some of them also can be systemically designed player growth, of like unlocking new characters over time, getting access to different cards as you play, unlocking new features as the game goes. I think that's a really important thing to like understand. What is the first time you play this game going to be like versus what is the 10th time versus what is the 100th time versus what is the 1,000th time, and what's going to be new and interesting every time you do that, because that's a really important question to ask for your game, because we don't want this to be a game you play 5 times and you're done. We want you to be playing this game for years. So that's a really important thing for us to think about. But then that also actually kind of dovetails into meta for like a player meta. I think that you don't really design around having a very specific meta from the start in any kind of game like this, because these games, it's a drafting game. It's so large, and there's so many combinations, and there's going to be potentially so many people playing it, that you can't expect people are going to fit into the boxes that you try and build for them. And ideally, you don't want them to. If you create a system where there are like 6 expected meta ways to play a character and that's it, you're going to run into a situation where the game's just not that fun, because everyone is going to be playing these 5 or 6 different builds, these 5 or 6 different styles. That being said, you also can't just design in a universe where there is no structure or guidance to any sort of cards in a card set, or ways things fit together. So you really need to have some idea of the types of things a character will do and a player might want to do on a run, and then make sure that your cards, your items, your skills fit those kind of concepts. That being said, I wouldn't say that that's prescribing a specific meta on a different character or on a different, in the game itself. It's more just making sure there are signposts and things to guide players and ways that you can build builds. And then ideally you have enough things to bridge around that stuff, so that people can experiment and can come up with their own stuff as they go. Like a really good example is if you look at modern Magic sets, the way that they do for their drafts, their multicolor uncommon design, where they will have a bunch of cards that kind of tell players these are the kind of things you want to do if you are drafting these colors. They call them signpost uncommons. And then that's not what you have to do if you're drafting those colors. And there's a lot of variable strategy that will go beyond that, but it kind of sets these flags that you can follow and have some idea of what will be supported in the card set without like having to memorize every single card that's out there, right? So ultimately, I think to answer the question of how we think about meta from a gameplay standpoint, we're basically thinking about these are the kind of things we expect you to be able to do, but we don't want to put you into a box where these are the only things you can do, right? And that's like a really tricky thing to navigate. And then trying to balance that along with trying to not make cards that are too complex, right? Like you can make a card support 5 different archetypes potentially by just putting a ton of text on it, but that's not a good way to do it either. You want to come up with ways that are modular and dynamic without being overwhelming, that can fit into a lot of things. So it's complicated, but it's really fun.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I really something that really strikes me and I really love about it is I think it, again, that kind of like core tenet, core philosophy you guys are talking about of meaningful choices shines through again in this exact same topic. It's like, oh, like you don't want it to be so many, like no structure at all, because then it'll just be too random. But if there's too much structure, then you eliminate meaningful choices, and that's really kind of one of the core philosophies of the Bazaar with our design team, and really with strategy games in general, right? Is just like having those meaningful choices, making like the choice that you make matter. That's what makes you're attached to your build, you're attached to like your run, and it makes it feel really unique and special. So
Yep,
I think that
exactly.
makes a lot of sense. Anything that you wanted to add on the end there, Derek?
Yeah, I guess I can add on this piece. Yeah, a lot of what Toby said is obviously correct and makes a lot of sense. I do think there's also this element of like layering the choices and such and the different styles of play in a way where certain ones are like more surface level and more obvious. One of the terms we use is first order strategy, where because when a new player comes into the game or a game in general, they're going to see a lot of different things. And it's good for the players to be able to have something to latch onto early, kind of like the signpost of that. If I do this thing, if I buy this item, if I draft this card, it's easy for me to see the path to continue to build on that. Something for me to latch onto so that I'm not overwhelmed by all the choices that I have. But then for the more experienced player, as you gain more experience and learn more of the card set and the mechanics that are in the game, then you start seeing the possibilities in the other cards that we have also put in there. But I think it's often important that in game design, when we're designing games for especially for larger audiences, that there's some kind of like first order strategy that players can latch onto and not get confused about how the game works.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Just
And
making
it's
sure it's easy for newer players. Yeah, go ahead, Toby.
a point to that is that actually ties back into what I was talking about before of like player meta strategy of like the progression of a player, right? If you
Yeah.
have the first order strategy ideas on a card that at the first couple times you play the game, you may think of a card in a certain way. And then as you learn more and you see more combinations and you understand more things that can be done, that can be layered on from a player and be their meta growth through the system, like a natural, non-system driven meta growth for the player for their understanding of the game and ways they're going to play differently the next time they play.
Perfect. Yeah. So the last question that I have is, if you had like any advice you would like give to younger you or people who are trying to break into the space of game design. I know Derek talked a little bit about this before, but what would be the advice you would give to aspiring game designers who want to work on a project like the Bazaar? Derek, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so I just start off with what I said before. It's like just make games. And to expand on that, it's like don't just think about games, don't just play games, you know, or don't just play games you like even, right? Like you want to play games, you want to break them down, you want to understand how they work. And then when you're making your own games, you need to actually go through the process of doing it, right? You want to write the design document, you want to create the content, you want to get some flashcards or whatever and make the cards and make the content and then show it to other people. Go through the entire process. Because you really haven't designed a game or made a game until you've done all the pieces. It's easy to just sit on your couch and play a game and be like, think about a couple of things on it and think you've made a game. But once you start going through the process of actually making the game, you realize that there's a lot of things that you didn't think about, that you have to think about when you're actually writing a document to describe all the rules of the game and be able to communicate that to other people, whether it's programmers or other players.
Yeah, I would say some good tack-ons to that are that specifically making board games and trying to write a manual for them can be extremely telling for this stuff of like there's so many basic things that you shorthand or think about when you play a game like that you realize that you need to actually write down and find a way to communicate them properly when you try and write an actual manual for something like a board game. That can teach you a lot. I would say two other things of note, like I really like Derek's point about playing all kinds of games, even ones you don't like. I went to a Richard Garfield talk, the original creator of Magic, years and years and years ago, where he talked about the fact that if there's any game that is popular, that is very successful, it is doing something right. It is doing something smart. And you should be playing that and figuring out what it's doing that is so successful. And his example was Farmville. He talked about Farmville to a room of like hardcore game designers, and people are laughing about it. And he's like, "This is an extremely successful game with millions and millions of players making a lot of money. You need to understand why. What is it doing? Even if it's just the way the social hooks link into it, or the way that it gets people back to come check in on something on a schedule, or the way it speaks to people in an emotional state. Like there's something that game is doing that you could potentially take and apply to your game in a different way." And people are very quick to disregard games that are not for them or not their kind of game, especially stuff that is casual. And trying to understand what it is about those games that is speaking to people is super, super valuable. Another point to the idea of making your own stuff is that I would go even further and say that you haven't really made your game until you've gotten critical feedback on it also, and then finding like being able to take and apply critical feedback. It's really hard, especially for starting designers. Like being able to come to make something that you think is great and is awesome, and then play it, and then realize it sucks, or that this part of it is not working, and let go of that is like a really valuable lesson that's hard to teach until you've actually done it. And hearing someone say, "I don't like this," and "this sucks," or even better, they're usually not going to say that to you, but watching them play and seeing that they don't seem to be having a great time is really, really, really valuable. And then also learning how to parse from feedback what is and isn't good, not necessarily based on what people are actually telling you, is a really important skill to develop. People are really good at knowing when they like and don't like something. They're not always great at identifying what part of it they do and don't like. Right. So they'll often give you feedback like, I don't like this. This is not fun. And they think it's for one reason, but it could actually be a completely different reason. And trying to figure out, like, the more you do it and the more you watch people and the more you tweak something based on feedback, the more you're going to see how people, like, what is actually like offending people and causing problems here, and what is the thing that's getting in people's way of the fun.
Yeah, I was going to say that one of the things you should also do instead of just playing games is also watching other people play games, whether it's ones that you've made or any other game, because having someone else experience or go through a game with you observing them will give you a different perspective, and sometimes that perspective may actually clash with the things they tell you.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, I really appreciate both of you taking the time to come and talk to us. I know that some of you guys in the audience were, hoping to hear a little bit more content-wise about the Bazaar, but we will in the future, hopefully, fingers crossed, be doing other sorts of interviews like this. So we'll dive more into that at a future date. But if you guys liked this sort of interview where you kind of just got to meet the team, learn about their philosophies and stuff like that, please make sure to let me know. I'd love to do similar types of interviews where you guys can meet other members of the team, maybe some of the art team, maybe someone on the more engineering side, and you can hear about them, their experiences, and even get some advice if that's something that you're looking to, branch into. I know a lot of people in the community are, interested in getting into game design. So thanks again, both of you, for your time, and thank you everybody who came and showed up. I appreciate you all.
Yeah, I was also going to say I'm always happy to answer questions if people have questions they want to shoot me. If it comes to specific Bazaar questions, I can only talk about what I'm allowed to talk about. But I'm happy to answer whatever I am allowed to answer.
Perfect. All right. Thank you guys so much, and I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend.
Yeah, you guys too. See ya.
Thanks everyone for coming. Bye.